Thank you for your warm reception, and thank you, Nico, and to Asia Society Switzerland for bringing me down to beautiful Switzerland. We were in Basel and Liestal yesterday, and today I've been enjoying many fine sights of Zurich. As Nico was quoting me in his introduction, I realized that the very statement of every statement having its opposite, it itself has something to contradict itself. Whether that catches me in a logical feedback loop, I'm not quite sure. But whatever opinion you have about broad statements of China, my approach when I first got there and started writing was always the universal through the individual, through the specific. I knew that as someone, however long I lived in China, or while I felt that I knew the country, ultimately I'm always an outsider, and I distrusted my own opinions, so I felt stories are always best. Individual stories. If I can shed some light, lift the lid on just 6 individual lives of a generation that encompasses 320 million people, then I can let people make their own minds up. So with that said, perhaps I'll start, as Nico suggests, with a short reading from one of the 6 people who I follow. His English name is Snail, self-selected, and this picks up his story from school. He comes from a very poor family in the countryside and the poor Chinese province of Anhui, the north of Anhui, and he is just preparing to take the college entrance examination. There was an unspoken understanding between Snail and his parents that whatever he did in this life, he would never be a farmer. The most crucial goal for him to settle in a city as a resident and not a migrant worker, like his father was. In the countryside, his family had prospered some and suffered some more, but now there was only stigma and poverty for them there, while the rest of the nation was transforming into an urban society. If their son didn't get out, he would miss out. Snail was a diligent student, and his parents put all their energy and savings into supporting him. When he got into one of the best high schools in the area, they were thrilled. Less than half of rural children attend high school in China, and even then, access is far from unequal, as the best teachers are poached by urban schools with higher fees. Those who drop out find work in factories and on construction sites, or as building security guards, chefs, drivers, hairdressers. Those who get a college degree have a chance at a better life. Knowledge changes destiny. More accurately, as Snail came to realize, the Gaokao changes destiny. China's college entrance exams are over in 2 days, but that single mark out of 700 decides which university a student will go to, and by extension their job and life prospects. From day 1 of middle school, students are drilled that preparing for those 2 days, 6 Junes later, is the sole purpose of their existence. The tradition of using a single examination result to separate the wheat from the chaff in China dates back to the 7th century with the old exam for the imperial civil service, the Keju. It can feel like little has changed. When the pace picks up in high school, students cram 14-hour days, and those with the highest marks are feted in the national press. At 6 a.m., Snail would rise and walk to the main building in school for first class at 7 a.m. At lunchtime, he went to the canteen and wolfed down sweet and sour pork or fish-flavored aubergine with a bowl of rice. After class, he jogged to the sports ground for football practice before dinner and homework until lights out at 10 p.m. Before he knew it, the day of judgment loomed. The Gaokao was upon him. Most of his knowledge was crammed by rote memorization. For the compulsory language and culture exam, critical thinking skills were frowned upon. Imaginative answers were wrong answers. The essay question, that carried a frightening percentage of the final mark, was infamous for its ambiguous prompts, but examiners weren't afraid to give essays 0 marks if a student got too creative, for instance, mocking an aspect of Chinese politics or society. Snail sat his exams on 6th and 7th June 2005 at another school down the road. Schools swapped exam halls to prevent scrolls being hidden in the chair legs. He took 4 3-hour papers, science, maths, English, and Chinese, each a stack of sheets crammed with diagrams and questions in small printed characters. That year in Anhui, there were 2 titles to choose between for the dreaded essay, Grasping the Journey of Life and The Bright and Dark Side of the Moon. Snail scribbled in spidery characters for an hour about grasping the journey of life, but can't remember a single word of what he wrote. Leading up to and during the exams, his mother moved into a hotel in town to be near him. She cooked all his meals, did his laundry, and made sure he had nothing to worry about except study. At 5 p.m., on the last afternoon of the exams, she waited with hundreds of other parents outside the school gates for him to come out of his final paper. When he stumbled out in a haze, she drove him back home in the family trike, cooked a large meal, and tried her best not to ask how it went. Snail thought it went fine, but as soon as he left the exam hall, he got the creeping sensation that all of that he had learnt was useless in the real world, begging to be forgotten. He could plot complicated mathematical graphs and solve university-level physics questions, but that wouldn't help him beyond his exam score. After 2 agonizing weeks, he rang a number to find out his mark, a breakdown of which was posted to his school. When the envelope arrived, he took out a thin slip of paper with the results of his exams and scanned down to find the combined single 3-digit number that would define the rest of his life.
And with that cliffhanger, we're stopping. If you want to know the score that Snail received and the life that followed as a result of that 3-digit score, you're going to have to read the book.
You're going to have to buy the book.
You're going to have to buy the book. You made it very clear in the quote that I read at the beginning that your intention with this book was not to explain China, because that's impossible. So what was your intention? What did you hope to achieve by writing this book and by telling these stories?
My intention is to bring the reader into the world of what it means to be young and Chinese inside mainland China, hopefully with a depth of texture and empathy, I hope, so that a reader can make her or his mind up about any value judgments or any opinion about the generation and about China. So one of the first decisions I made in the book is that I wouldn't be in it. The word I doesn't appear until the author's note on page 313, rather to let the stories of other individuals shine without the filter of me as the guide. Obviously, 6 people aren't going to represent a whole generation, they're only going to represent themselves, but I hoped that just as a pointillistic picture and painting, such as some of the fine ones you have on display in Zurich, such they can evoke a larger image. I hoped also that the 6 points of 6 very different young Chinese lives can evoke a wider mosaic of a generation.
You mentioned before that I think there are 320 million people from that generation in China alone. So the 320 million people who were born between 1985 and 1990. How did you narrow that down to 6?
With great difficulty, although sometimes, China's such a fascinating place to be as a writer. I sometimes think I could have just picked the first 6 people off the street I saw and they would have had great stories. But I went through many iterations and talked to many people. All of those individuals I profile were in Beijing when I met them, so that I could spend a lot of time with them, but I took pains to travel with each of them back to their hometowns to understand where they came from. And part of the equation was to pick people from all over China. One of them comes from a tropical island to China's south, Hainan Island. One from the freezing northeast on the border of Russia. Snail is from very rural countryside. Another young woman, Mia, is from the deserts of Xinjiang province. And to pick people from different backgrounds so that if not something comprehensive, far be it, at least there would be a range.
In the passage that you read to us, we hear about this Gaokao and this incredible pressure that basically starts on the first day of middle school all the way up to this exam where everything that a student does is just focused on doing well in this exam, and everything that follows after is a result of having done well in this exam. And I think, assuming that for most of us here, that feels kind of outdated. It's not knowledge changes destiny, it's rote memorization of things that are afterwards not important anymore, which apparently changes destiny. Do you see the scene that you've read is now 12, 13 years ago? Do you see the attitudes in China towards that system changing? Are people still believing that this is the right system to provide the country with the talent it needs, also and the very different talent it will need in the future than it might have in the past?
Yes, the Gaokao college entrance examination has been under discussion of reform really ever since it relaunched in 1978 at the end of the Cultural Revolution, and there's always every year a national debate in China about it, as for widely perceived disadvantages, primarily the pressure placed on students to perform well over 2 days, which often leads to, or occasionally leads to tragedies such as students harming themselves, and also whether it's a fair capture of a student's ability when it's a purely an academic gauge. At the same time, no one seems to, a lot of people don't really seem to have the will to reform it, because in some ways it's very popular, especially among China's middle classes, as a leveler of society, as something at least perceived as meritocratic, whereby someone from an unprivileged background such as Snail, by dint of his hard work and his study, would be able to gain access to a city and to a university and to a city job after that, as Snail did, after great struggles, without giving anything away. So many people perceive it as a leveler, and it's been quite difficult to reform. That said, there are experimentation zones. Shanghai is one, and this coming year, China has again said that it's looking into some limited reforms. So it's tricky. Sometimes it's the sort of the least worst system that we've tried, to paraphrase Winston Churchill.
You described this Gaokao as being this very, very defining thing, and without giving away too much, the character we've heard from does well in the exam. What happens to the people who don't? So there must be people who really, really screw this one up because they're blocked, or they didn't study the right thing, or they just panic. And so it's these 2 days. What happens with them afterwards? What happens to you, regardless of your background, if you really, really screw up your Gaokao?
Well, sometimes it can dictate the rest of your life, especially if you resign yourself to a result that you feel wasn't representative of your best ability, and go to a lower level college. Often college pressure is really taken off in college in China, and job prospects are often dictated by what college you go to. You can retake the Gaokao, and many people do wait a year and retake it. And for some people, the measure of success is changing. Another of people I write about, his English name is Lucifer, another interesting one, and he couldn't be more different from his parents, because who sell tractor parts. He has one goal in life, which is to become an international superstar. So his career path was always to go on talent shows and be a singer and have a band, and he totally flunked his Gaokao and got an absolutely rubbish score and ended up in a music school. But he went an unconventional path, which more and more people are choosing. In terms of the education system, I think the more tragic truth is that those unprivileged students are weeded out of the system even before they get to the level of that university exam. Only 50% of children in China's rural areas go to high school because of unequal educational resources. So a lot of people in the true countryside don't enter high school at all and opt to begin working in a factory, which makes sense for them and their families in many ways. And that's what China is trying to address.
there's an understanding between Snail that we just heard from and his parents, and it's so obvious that apparently it doesn't even have to be spelled out. It's an implicit understanding that whatever becomes of him, he's not going to become a farmer like his parents were. So he will get an education and he'll move into the city. It seems like the moving into the city part is almost as important, if not more, than the getting a good education part. So how big is this rural and urban divide in China, and is it actually getting bigger, or is it at some point also getting smaller?
Well, in terms of numbers, it's diminishing in that China is urbanizing apace. It's now about 50-50 rural-urban. But in terms of, I think, a more intangible divide between the city and the countryside, I personally would say that gulf is widening in terms of often how someone is considered in the city. If they've moved there from the countryside, they would be called a Waidiren, an outsider, a migrant. In Beijing, where I live, a lot of migrants have now been evicted in this rather cruel campaign in the middle of winter. Their homes denied them in -7 degrees Celsius winter nights. So there is, and among the populace, a strong divide between someone who's a city person and a country person. So the way I think of it is that that's China's class. I'm British, so of course class is everywhere. One of the reasons I left. And that's how I figure China's class system works. But for someone like Snail, one of the real causes of that pressure is the fact that it's a generation of single children. So the reason he knew that he must not become a father and didn't want to become a farmer is because he all of the hopes and expectations of that family, none of whom had gone up to university until him, were upon his shoulders.
And it seems like this pressure that we've heard about and that you mentioned a couple of times is almost like one of the, I think, like major themes of the book. There's so much pressure on this generation. It's the pressure to do well in school, the pressure to do well at the Gaokao, the pressure then to find a good, stable job, preferably at a bank or something. And then there's the pressure to get married at 23, lest your parents start sending you text messages every day. So there's really this incredible amount of pressure from the parents and from the society. And we're going to hear a little bit more about a different kind of pressure on a different character whose name is Dahai. And his problem is not school. He's already older at that point. His problem is relationships.
Indeed. And I remember, of course, that the generation I'm writing about is really quite a thin sliver. Those born between 1985 and 1990 in Chinese would be the term the 85后, the post-85s, of which I am one. I'm now 32. And that generation, I'm not sure what it is for even younger generations in China today, perhaps less as their parents are of a different generation. But for that sliver, they're sort of stuck in the middle of China's transition from rural to urban and rich to poor, and bear the brunt, as many millennials do all over the world, of a tightened economy and more inequality. One of the consequences of which is the expectations of parents to live a certain life and after the university exam to get a good job and to marry early. And so I thought that I would read a second passage from Dahai struggling with these challenges. Dahai is the nickname of another character. He grew up on a military compound near Beijing, as his father was military personnel, and he's already had a strong anti-authoritarian streak, but is kept down by his society. There were 3 halves expected of a man: a flat, a car, and savings. With those, it was implied he could attract the 4th, someone to share them with. Dahai had none. That was called a sanwunan, a 3 withouts man. Instead, he faced the 3 highs: high property costs, high car prices, and high medical fees. He had been promoted to assistant engineer, and his salary had gone up to 5,000 yuan a month, even though his duties overseeing the construction of an underground tunnel were the same. But it wasn't nearly enough, and housing prices in Beijing were so far out of his reach that the flats might as well have been on the moon. He did a napkin calculation once of how long he would have to work at this rate until he could buy one, and came up with the depressing figure of 50 years. Dahai was a bare branch, guangguo, the Chinese term for single men. With an estimated 118 boys born to each 100 girls in his generation, there were over 20 million of them already, graphed to rise to 40 million by 2040. They were competing for the same pool of women, in the knowledge that some of them would never find a wife, and many worried that they wouldn't make the cut. The phrase for the masculine ideal was gao fu shuai, the tall, rich, handsome, the equivalent for women being bai fu mei, which, right, and pretty. Dahai was tall and not bad looking, with strong features and a new buzz cut, but again, he fell short of the hat trick. He was stuck in work he didn't like, single and frustrated. There just weren't that many ways to meet someone. Hooking up at bars was fine for flower princes, the Chinese term for playboys, but not for ordinary Joes looking for a life partner. Most 20-somethings still relied on their circle of friends and colleagues to make introductions, which limited options. Online dating had taken off in a big way, and websites with names like Cherished Love and Beautiful Destiny existed not to facilitate casual flings, but with those with marriage in mind, groom seeking bride, bride seeking groom. When you signed up, questionnaires asked for information including height, education level, monthly salary, and home ownership status. Speed dating was the same, each partner ascertaining marital compatibility in 8 minutes or less. Then there was the literal marriage market. Every weekend at public parks in Beijing and Shanghai, the boulevards were lined with rows of adverts touting not goods but people. A typical one read, Beijing male, born 1987, undergraduate degrees, height 1.73 meters, has car and flat. It wasn't the lovebirds who posted them, but their anxious parents, seeking a suitable match for their sons and daughters. In one such market, next to the moat of the Forbidden City, there was no one under 50 in sight, only rows of sellers sitting on fold-away stools, while the buyers, also parents, browsed the adverts, jotting down telephone numbers to pass on to their child, who would roll their eyes at mum and dad and rarely follow up on an arranged match. To get anything worth having in China, Dahai came to realize either you had to play dirty or bend to the system completely. The rich second generation had it all, and there was no shortage of girls chasing them. His work unit bosses sounded just like the socialist slogan banners around them. As for officials and businessmen, he simply assumed they were corrupt. The clean route to success was hard to see, and it was easy enough to turn anyone into a cynic. Along with the other bare branches of his generation, Dahai was starting to snap.
And before he does, again, we'll stop here. One of the reasons why poor Dahai is in trouble, of course, is the one-child policy, and the entire generation you write about is a product of this policy, which I think ended only a few years ago. So they're all only children, or a lot of them are. There's a strong pressure on them. What has that done to them? What has growing up as only children, facing all these pressures, but also facing incredible rapid change and growth in their country, what has that done to that generation? How's the one-child policy affected the country as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of some psychological impacts, I occasionally feel the one-child policy is something of a straw man in that you're never short of people your generation. You have a lot of cousins and such like in China or close friends. So I think that it's difficult to feel lonely in a country with as many people in China. But I think the parental pressure is key. There's sometimes the phrase 4-2-1 as a rule in China, which you would have 4 grandparents, 2 parents, all laying their expectations on the shoulders of a single child. And remember that these parents and grandparents grew up in a very different China, and the parent of someone born in the 80s would have lived through the Cultural Revolution and deprivation. and want their child to really seize the opportunities and the riches of the new China, and that only exacerbates their wishes for their child's success, and often conventional or conservative success. Meanwhile, the child has grown up in a totally different environment. If the parent was used to seeing anti-capitalist slogans, red letter posters, then the child would grow up in a China surrounded by McDonald's and Coca-Cola advertisements, the direct opposite. I often think of the children of these, or the people I write about and their parents, as occupying different universes. In England and Europe and America, one might think of a generation gap coming every maybe 15 years, maybe 20 years, the difference between you and your parents. In China, there's a phrase, 3年一个代沟, a generation gap every 3 years. And someone born in 1987 would have grown up in a different environment already to someone born just 3 years earlier in 1984. So the pace of change only widens that gap.
Now, most of the characters that you write about in the book are between 25 and early 30s. Some of them actually already have kids of their own. And as you said, like those kids, again, are like not one generation, but in Chinese terms, 3-4 generations ahead of their parents. What does the post-80 people tell you about how they want to raise their kids, and how is that different from how they were raised by their parents, who often grew up in a very, very different setting?
Yeah, I mean, one of the people I wrote about, Xiao Xiao, she's from the Northeast. She told me that when she has a kid, whatever she does, she's not going to give them the same pressure that she's had, and in particular, if it's a girl, she's not going to send her daughter texts every day above the age of 24 asking when she's going to get married. So I think an individual is often formed in quite largely by the environment, but also the parental environment. And as this generation grows older and has kids, as some of them already are, Snail has a baby girl, I think they're bringing forwards different values, different attitudes, different expectations of education, for example. But as with everything in China, it's all of the variables, so many variables, whether you're born in the countryside or the city, whether you're poor or rich, what resources you have access to are just as important.
One of the outlets that Dahai finds, with all the pressure from work and having to find somebody, is the internet. And he becomes, or is already at that point, an online activist, a self-described netizen, and he rails against corrupt officials and environmental pollution on Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter. How important for Chinese society are these online conversations, and do you feel they have actually the potential to change anything in reality?
Yeah, I think technology has been hugely transformational and probably one of the biggest factors on the lives of the generation I write about, the post-85s. To take Dahai as an individual example of something we can't make generalizations about, he got really into, first it was blogs. He was reading Han, the novelist and race car driver you might have read yourselves, online, and reading BBS forums and following the news and what people his generation were talking about in a way that simply wasn't possible before the advent of the internet because of the control exerted on other modes of media. That continued with the rise of Weibo, the microblogging platform, which is sort of Twitter and Facebook both rolled into one, and continues today with WeChat, the WhatsApp equivalent. But as those new modes rose, so too did the efforts to control what was on them, and now I would say that there's a lot tighter and smaller atmosphere for expression. But it's always been a game of cat and mouse. So Dahai, he wouldn't be able to call out something by name, but in Chinese is a language full of puns and homonyms, so you can slightly change the pronunciation. And if you want to say something which means, for 3 characters, that means F your mum, you can change them to mean grass mud horse. Or if you want to poke fun at the old propaganda slogan of a harmonious society, you can change it to river crab, and people would find pictures of river crabs and a Peruvian alpaca, which people thought looked like the grass mud horse, and post them online. So there was always these methods and these pressure valves to express yourself. I think that environment has tightened. So I think we haven't seen what a lot of people thought the internet was going to do, which is to really open up society. But I would say have more patience and be cognizant of the impacts it's had on this generation, who after all do have so much more access to information than any generation before. And a lot of people just hop over the Great Firewall with a VPN and have access to a wealth of information.
One thing that Dahai, but I'm sure many others, rail against online and that stokes a lot of anger is corruption, perceived corruption of officials. And that's also something that the current Chinese government has promised to fight against and has made a big deal of sort of trying to root out. Is that something that resonates with the people that you know and that you write about? So do they actually see progress in that field, and is that being perceived as positive?
Well, in many respects, there has been progress in that field, and people often forget how popular Xi Jinping is right now, because he's done what pretty much everyone in China wanted done for the last 20 years, which is to crack down on corruption. And so, to take Dahai again, he was very angry at his at various government abuses and scandals, and he would repost a lot of this news and write angry things about it. But then there was also a certain moment later in his life, perhaps along with his age, when he turned 26, 27, when he realized that for all of this anger online among him and his friends, nothing was actually changing in society. And he became quite disillusioned, and he stopped posting so much. And his bare branch didn't snap, but it bent. And that was a story I came across quite often, which is a feeling of disengagement with your society or politics at the top level, because you can't directly change it. And that's very different, I think, to apathy and to not caring. But I think it was quite an understandable decision of many members of the generation who I talked to just focus on themselves, focus on your own life in a way that their parents weren't able to. But the individual freedoms in China are unrestrained, all but for certain areas of civil society and politics. So if you can vastly improve your own life, sort of why would you expend all that energy on something that you can't change? That's the opinion I came across quite a lot.
And it seems that's also, in a way, and that's certainly true for Dahai, it's also a matter of growing up. He is this very sort of anti-system, somewhat revolutionary streak in his early 20s, and then kind of reality sets in, and he has a job, and he's more concerned with like finding a wife than sort of posting online. And to me, that seems not all that different, maybe from experiences that people in their 20s in Western societies would make. But still, if you would try to compare, and again, that's a generalization, sort of the average level of interest in politics and societal change in China as the Chinese young people compared with their peers in the UK, say, do you feel it's comparable, or are the Chinese more disengaged or more engaged? Is it a conversation topic that's that is part of their lives at all?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I agree with you that everything I said about Dahai, you could also say about a young Swiss or a young Brit or a young American. And part of the reason I wanted to write the book, and by focusing on individual stories, is to show that there is more in common than there is that holds us apart, and more the universal story of being young and growing old in China within a very different environment. That's how I think of it. The same, but in a different environment. For example, if I was born in Britain, but Britain had not 60 million people, but 300 million people, and we were all competing for the same spots in university and for jobs or for women, then that would be that would have an impact on me. And if I grew up in a Britain where there was a single party who was taking all the decisions and indeed improving the quality of life and the economy in Britain, then I'm not sure that I would be on my feet in anger every day of my life, as sometimes I feel a particular sort of Western idea or expectation of China still holds currency. So it's an incredibly intricate issue, and there's a whole variety of sensible and reasonable opinions about politics in China, but by and large, I would say this is the age of individualism, not of the collective, and that means beginning by transforming my life as a young Chinese rather than transforming necessarily my society. And so that's probably the most common story I saw.
And it seems to me, from reading the book, what struck me, that the people you portray, in general, they're socially very liberal, or at least they're socially very liberal compared to their parents. They're for more free speech, and they're for LGBT rights, and it's all of that. That's sort of kind of like the general social attitudes that you would also expect from somebody that age in the UK or in Switzerland or in the US. But none of them would go as far, at least not for a long period of their lives, of actually questioning the current political system in China. And to me, and I think maybe also to other people looking at that from here, from the outside, that kind of can feel like a contradiction, but it doesn't to them. Like for them, that's perfectly, like those two things go perfectly well together. Can you maybe explain how would they justify that, or how can they sort of combine those two attitudes into one sort of coherent view?
Well, cognitive dissonance is something that you have to become rather good at when you live in China. And I broadly agree with what you say. I always try when I can to avoid the formulation sort of they are, because of course you'll find many people who do hold very strong political opinions, both against and for, both socially liberal and deeply illiberal and nationalistic.
But there's like no broad movement anywhere in sight that would sort of, that would have like political influence.
Where is the appetite for change that is sometimes demanded of China? I haven't seen it. And dissident voices are very much amplified in the West, but are not sort of felt very strongly in the sort of hidden consciousness of many people I meet in China. So I think, by and large, yes, I think just as people are focusing on their lives rather than focusing on changing the country, I think in a way that is changing the country, because I think I've met, you meet so many young Chinese people who, just like young Chinese people here, have socially liberal views. This is borne out in survey data as well, whether it's about women's rights or LGBT rights, or just lifestyle choices and connection to the world and knowledge of the world and being plugged into the international community. I think it's almost becomes obvious when you sort of talk to someone from China, especially if you meet people, the Chinese people who've come to Zurich. That's it's a truism that China is part of the world today, and I think it's then important to understand that all of that can coexist with China as it is today, as a one-party state, as a one-party state which is making China sort of richer and stronger, which is what most people want. Now, I have my own personal opinions. I come from a very liberal background about that, but I sort of think that my opinion is the least important there. I'm much more interested in finding out what the majority of Chinese people think. Both in all of the 6 people I wrote about and pretty much everyone else I've talked to, with the exception of certain very brave dissidents and those who've paid the human price for China, most seem perfectly happy within that space of cognitive dissonance, where you would want reform but not revolution, and complain about many issues within your country but still be very much behind China as it rises, and why shouldn't they be?
So it's fairly obvious that the Chinese government over the last few years has decided to change and elevate, in a certain sense, the role of China in the world. So the days of kind of strategic patience are gone, and now it's all about shaping the world and like positioning yourself as a leader of the free world. That comes through fairly strongly from a lot of what the government does and says. How do, again, the people that you've spoken to for this book and the people that you're surrounded by in China, how do they feel about that goal? Or what ideas do they have as to what role China should play in the world going forward? Is that a topic of discussion at all?
Yeah, I think they feel pretty great about it. As China becomes stronger and more proactive on the world stage, and indeed, 20 years ago, the official policy of China was, in the words of Deng Xiaoping, Ta Guang Yang Hui, to nourish obscurity and bide your time. And now Xi Jinping has reversed that formulation and saying we've bid our time, and we're nourishing the limelight, and that China is going to become a stronger, more active role internationally, just as it continues to grow richer. And that's led, in combination with a very controlled education system when it comes to politics, to a resurgence of nationalism, which is absolutely palpable, both at home and abroad. I was watching the film Wolf Warrior 2, which is a nationalistic film of sort of Chinese action flick set on an overseas military base, and I was watching with the Chinese comments, which would flash up on the screen, bullet comments as they're called, and everyone was just bursting with patriotism for China, and militarism almost, by turns sort of quite disquieting as well. So I think a lot of young people have really gotten behind this idea of China on the rise and China stronger on the world, whereas maybe 10 years ago it was slightly different or slightly more defensive pose.
You briefly mentioned before Han, who was a race car driver and a blogger, and you quote him in the book, and I think it's actually one of his last or the last blog posts before he kind of like signs off. Mm-hmm. And he writes, "I have faith in the character of the people of your generation, and I believe these freedoms," he means free speech and democracy, will come sooner or later. Mm-hmm. So the post-80s generation you write about, it's a generation next in line to assume political and economical power in China. Do you feel like once this generation is in power, will things change radically? Will they turn the country into something else, or will they largely continue on the path that has been given?
I think things already are changing and already have changed radically, but the people in charge of China are of a very different generation and project a rather different image. It's interesting to note that in those 3 posts, Han also iterated to the disapproval of some of his readers, especially abroad, that he wanted China to go through a slow process of reform, and he even said that China wasn't ready for democracy. A widely shared opinion among very educated and thoughtful people, including those I profile in the book. But he still has faith in the generation. Partly, perhaps, he's referring to that social liberalism, which I very much believe is true, an acceptance of the importance of free speech and rule of law, even among those people who who don't think that democracy is right for China. And in another blog post, Han said that he likes the generation because they don't cut in queue or spit on the floor. I share his faith. I was writing about people of my age. I've met very few people of my generation in China who I didn't like, and I think what China will be in 30 years' time when they're in power, that's a mug's game. I'm not going to predict it, but I think they've already changed China, and they're already changing the social fabric, led by the cities, while, of course, in the countryside and lower-tier cities, the priorities are very different. But for a social, urban vanguard, even an elite vanguard, I think under the surface, China is already changed.
On that subject of change and things that are changing, over the last 2 days in our conversations, you said several times that everything in China is changing all the time. Mm-hmm. You've been there for a little more than 10 years. What is something that hasn't changed? What is something that has stayed the same mm-hmm. throughout all these years that you've been in the country, while everything around it has completely changed? Mm-hmm.
It's a very good question. Probably the food. But not to be too glib, I think that even though, and this is testing my assertion that you quoted, that every statement you can think of the opposite. I do think that everything about China is changing. Now, can I think of the opposite? I think as China changes, one thing that I've seen stay the same throughout the small window that I've observed over the last 10 years has been a drive and an ambition to transform your life as an individual in China, which I think together has transformational potential for the country. Evan Osnos, the former New Yorker writer based in China, his formulation was Age of Ambition, the ambition of driving China's forwards. For the primary image of my book, Wishlanterns, I chose a flying lantern which would take your wishes along with the wind. And I'm constantly quite impressed by the forwards movement, the drive, and the adaptability to how China changes to really push for something ambitious in China's future. It might be something we want, it might be something we don't want, because a lot of the some of China's push overseas, can be aggressive or at the cost of other countries. But in terms of individual lives, I think that's something that has always been there.
And that ambition that you mentioned is, of course, a great and totally unexpected segue into the next and last part that you will read before we open to your questions. It's actually the last 2 pages of the book. There are no spoilers, but it does explain a little bit more on why the book is called Wishlanterns, and it's about a character named Xiao Xiao.
That's right. This is the last few paragraphs of the book, and I think it speaks for itself as to that emblematic image of hopes for the future, whatever it will be. The 15th and final night of the New Year period in China was Lantern Festival. It was a day traditionally marked by eating sweet glutinous rice balls filled with red bean paste in hot water, and by solving riddles. It was also a night for lovers, who would sneak out to light lanterns together under the first full moon of the new year. That evening, Xiao Xiao's extended family gathering got together in a restaurant for one last big meal. While they slurped their glutinous rice balls, the fireworks started, a final chance for the residents of Nehe to paint the skies red before festivities ended. After dinner, Xiao Xiao split off from her elders, who were going to bed. She wanted to walk into the center of town, and 2 of her friends and a cousin came with her. She pulled on her winter furs, tightened her scarf, and went out into the street amid the crackle and patter of firecrackers. They headed in the direction of the park, where the biggest crowd was gathering. Along the way, other groups and couples joined them, walking south down the main road. Above them was an opposite current, thousands of Wishlanterns flying north on the wind. Xiao Xiao had brought one with her, and at a crossroads within sight of the park, she unpacked it, careful not to tear the thin red tissue paper. The corners had to be prized apart from flat until the wire frame opened and the gossamer walls bloomed into a cube. Into a tin cage, suspended at the open base, she nestled the firelighter, whose heat would give the lantern its lift. As a fire hazard, it was illegal to set them flying on the street. That was only allowed in the park, from where the stream of twinkling yellow lights was coming. A fire truck was on alert just up the road from where Xiao Xiao opened hers, but her cousin was an off-duty policeman, and he said it was okay. His armpit bulged with more flat-pack lanterns, which his on-duty colleagues had confiscated from another group and given to him instead. She kindled the firelighter and pinched the delicate upper corners of the frame as it filled with hot air. When the sides began to swell, she let go. The lantern bobbed down and for a moment looked like it was going to kiss the concrete, but a gentle touch kept it aloft. It hovered sideways before lifting into the night. There it joined the sky river with the others, 1,000 wishes on the air like migrating fireflies. Each lantern carried a heart beating softly inside its paper chest, fragile and buoyant, buffeted by the wind. Each light was watched anxiously by whoever had wished on it, to see how far it might fly. Xiao Xiao watched hers until it disappeared. Then she turned and walked on.
Thank you very much.